joining us in what appears to be a day full of miserable weather. Hopefully you're not getting too cold and you're enjoying the drinks, and you're going to be enjoying some great speakers today. So thank you. So welcome to today's sixth and final talk at Planted Countries Save Our Soil event, brought to you in partnership with the National Trust and filmed on the deck of our beautiful off-the-grid cabin from out of the valley. My name's Oliver Heath, and I'm the Biophilic Design Advisor for Planted, the only design event focused on reconnecting people, spaces and nature. At Planted, we want to make the commercial case for taking a nature-first approach in all aspects of our life to create a cleaner, greener, happier and healthier, more sustainable environment. In this series of talks, we're exploring why the earth is so important for food, farming and nature, and asking what role design can play in encouraging the use of local materials whilst reducing the demand on already overstretched natural resources. Today we're going to be discussing the subject of we are what we eat. The way in which we treat our soils is reflected in the produce that we create from them, and in turn our own well-being. Almost everything we eat relies on soils in some way, shape or form, and ultimately the impact of farming systems is not just on ourselves but all living things on the planet. But if we keep producing and over-consuming as we are, whilst perpetuating the enormous levels of waste, our soils will get depleted and eventually collapse. It's a bleak picture, and as the shocking statistic reminds us, we only have 60 more harvests left in the soil. Clearly, our food systems and the way of producing them are fundamentally broken. So we're here today to discuss the deceptively simple issue of soil health and the enormous ramifications it has on all living things on our planet. And here to discuss this with us today are two titans of the food industry. Don't laugh. You're going to demonstrate that to everybody. Okay, well, they're enormously experienced, very knowledgeable, very entertaining, and they're going to tell you a thing or two about it. So we've got Mark Shayler, and from APE, who is a sustainable food consultant, systems thinker, creator, strategist, and activist, and Stewart Dodd, CEO of Cottage. So the format is that basically each speaker is going to introduce themselves for around 5 minutes, tell us a little bit about their background, their interests and passion on soil health and food systems. Then we're going to enter into a panel discussion, and then about half an hour, and then after that we're going to have time for some questions from you, the audience. So if you've got any questions, write them down, scroll them down, make sure they've got a question mark at the end and they're not a statement, and we'll get to those at the end. But to begin with, I'd like to invite Stewart to just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the food industry and why it's so important and what your role is within it.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. So just to be a bit transparent, Oliver and I have known each other for 30 years. So I'm an architect by training, and we went to architecture school together for quite a long time. It takes a long time to become an architect. And over the years I started engaging in designing sustainable buildings, and Hugh Fernley-Whittingstall was one of my old friends, and he was my first client really when I set up my architecture practice. So over the years I started to invest in Cottage, become one of the partners, sat on the board, and eventually 4 years ago Hugh decided he wanted to change his business, and he asked me at the time if I was interested in taking a larger stake in the company. And I remember we were sitting, there were three of us who had the majority shareholding in the business. We were sitting in a restaurant called Cov's Vardis in London, talking about who we would employ as the chief executive for our sort of newly structured business. And I went to the bathroom, and Hugh and Guy, the other two owners, basically colluded. And when I came back, they said, "We've decided who the new CEO is." And I said, "Oh, great, you might have, talked to me about that first." And they said, "Oh, it's okay, it's you." And I said, "Okay, right, well, are you sure that's the right thing?" And they said, "Well, you've been involved in Cottage for 20 years, designing all the buildings and engaged in purchasing the farm that we own in Devon, which is a 100-acre farm." And they said, "We think you should try and do it." And I suppose I just hit 50. It was a career change move. And actually, I'm very passionate about food. And although I don't think I'm really that great with food. My partner, who is a brilliant chef and really interested in everything to do with food, does sort of, maybe she's just being generous, she does say I can actually cook quite well, so that's quite handy. And Hugh obviously is very happy to eat my food at home without being too critical, although he's pretty critical still. So I've spent my life being an architect, and 4 years ago I took over the reins at River Cottage. So we are, you'll all know from the media, we're a media company, so we make a television show, Hugh does, called River Cottage, which hasn't been on TV for 9 years, but it will be coming back to our screens in June this year. We've just made a new series of River Cottage for the first time in 9 years, and it's all made on our farm in Devon, which is an organic farm. It's a small holding really. We have animals, so we have a herd of ruby red Devon cattle, we have sheep, pigs, we used to have some chickens till the foxes killed them all recently. We grow all our own produce. All the food that's used at River Cottage in our restaurant, in our cookery school, comes from our land. We engage in about 30% of the produce we use, maybe 35 this year, is grown on our land. We have a traditional kitchen garden, and then we have a market garden which grows things like leeks and onions and brassicas. And one thing I've learnt in the last few years a lot is about the soil and how that's really important. So Adam Crofts, who's our head gardener, he has actually designed the main show garden at RHS Hampton Court this July. So River Cottage is the main show garden there, designed by Adam, and it's a no-dig bed production garden, which is slightly rare for the types of shows where there are normally lots of flowers and things. So it's purely vegetables grown in the garden at Hampton Court Palace. It's a replica of our kitchen garden at River Cottage in Devon. And he's basically taught me quite a lot about permaculture and soil health over the last few years. One of the things that I found really interesting actually was the fact that because we're an organic farm, we don't put anything on our land. So there's no pesticides, no fertilizers, nothing. We use no peat composts, etc. One of the things that he says really great about no-dig beds is actually the fact that it reduces the number of slugs. And he said it really, because basically as a garden team, you pick all the slugs off because that's the only way to get rid of them. So it's quite an unenviable task, I think, for the garden team to do that. So, there are some real benefits of that, but the whole soil process is something that Adam's been teaching me for the last 4 years. And it's actually quite fascinating how he works the soil and how he ferments all. So, for instance, all the tomatoes we grow, he collects the seeds every year, he ferments them all, and then they all go back through the process, and he reseeds them in our propagation tunnels, and then puts them all back into the earth, into the no-dig beds that we have in our tunnels. So, there's a really fantastic circular motion going on there with all the soil. It obviously reduces the amount of energy that the garden team need to do, as in there's no digging, pretty straightforward. But a massive help to the amount of time and energy the garden team need to spend, which allows them to do a lot more. So, over the years I've learned quite a lot about that. I've learned quite a lot about farming as well. Which is it's a challenging business to be in. So, hopefully we can have an interesting discussion about soil health and how all of our food is grown in this country, and then the pitfalls also about growing your own food and where the important things lie. But
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver.
Mark.
Thank you. We're all weirdly connected through Hugh in a funny kind of way.
Yeah.
So I'm an environmental scientist. I've worked with small businesses and big businesses alike for 33 years now, and I feel really old and tired, and that's because it's been hard work. But suddenly everyone's woken up and sustainability is cool, and I'm sat there going, yeah, I told you it was going. They've all caught me up, the buggers. And I've worked in a whole range of things. So permaculture, so my passion initially, Nick and I used to live up in Bradford, and we set up the Bradford Permaculture Association. We set up the Bradford Local Exchange Trade-in. We invested ourselves hugely in the community farm, and I'd forgotten about this until you were talking actually. But that whole taking a share in a pig, taking a share in that was a really brilliant way of understanding why the dirt beneath your nails really matters, and why the feedback systems truly matter. And then I went into corporate world and I was head of sustainability for Asda, Walmart for a horrible period. I told a story about that earlier, which I won't repeat now. And so I've worked for the dark side as well as the good side. And it's a different business now. I'm not saying it's bad, but back then it was bad. And I've got this real love of dirt and love of soil and love of playing. And I worked in biomimicry, bioregionalism and biophilia 1993. I did a thesis on that. Really enjoyed that work, and then went into reed bed building. So we built, if you're dealing with effluent, you can deal with it in many ways, including chemical treatment. But if you plant Australia's Phragmites reeds, you get this incredible 70 centimetre soil-based root zone. And in the root zone, most people put reeds in gravel and they just use it for polishing, for reducing acidity. But if you plant it in soil, you get these pockets of aerobic and anaerobic digestion within the same column. So you can deal with different pollution levels really, really well. Take raw amines, co-coven effluent. We were taking ICI, it's called Air Products now, up at Billingham. We planted a massive reed bed there, which is now, ironically, now protected. The factory's gone and the reed bed stays because the bittern population absolutely love it. So we kind of rewilding, but in an organised way, i.e. not wilding, replanting. And I spent a lot of time structuring soils in order to deal with effluent, not thinking I was doing anything to do with soils. I was developing non-black box pollution treatment systems. And then I went into sustainable design of product packaging, clothing. Really enjoyed that. Did some work with Hugh. Do you remember the Coffee Cups TV show that Hugh did? Remember the slightly chubby chap sat in a cafe with Hugh? That was me. That was me. And the interesting thing there, it was a very powerful piece of telly. It's like 3 minutes. And it was the one they used to trail it, which I was very proud of. Not as proud as Hugh was, obviously, because he kind of really made that show special. But I remember the conversation around the coffee cup. And we'd finished filming. And Hugh said, "These things really are dreadful, aren't they?" I said, "They are." I said, "Do you know what the carbon footprint of the cup is?" And he went, "No." And I said, "It's about 33 grams of carbon equivalent for the cup." He said, "Is that bad?" I said, "Well, it's not good." And I said, "But do you know what the carbon footprint of a latte is?" And he said, "No." And I said, "It's about 350 grams of carbon for the latte." And Hugh did, "Oh, that'll be the hot water." He did all that. And I went, "No, it's the milk. It's the milk." I said, "So if you leave 10% of your coffee, you may as well have used 2 cups. So drink all your coffee. Like it really matters. The biggest environmental impact is the food that we have grown. Never the packaging that it comes in. It's the food that we've grown. We sometimes get a bit confused about that. And now I run an environmental agency now, and I also run a project called Save Our Soil, which it's got a commercial arm called Springfield Agri, where we build workshops and conferences around regenerative agriculture. And there's a thing that interests me here, and it's just beginning, is an enterprise arm where we're beginning to measure soil carbon content and organic content in order to understand what we need to do. If we're to hit 4 parts per thousand, we can begin to reverse climate change about 10 to 12 years. That is staggering, and that all happens down there, and that means we need to change the way that we farm. Is that right? Is that enough?
That's loads.
Right, Ace.
That's absolutely tax. That's taken out most of my questions, actually. But let's go back a little bit, because we kind of said that our soils are being depleted, but could you just kind of run over some of those ideas of what are we doing to our soils and why are they getting depleted, and what is both the physical impact of that on the soils themselves, but also a sort of societal reflection on that we just disconnected from it, the understanding of it.
Well,
So what are we doing to our soils that is so bad?
Well, there's lots, right? So firstly, we're over chemically treating it. Secondly, we're over ploughing it and not covering it over in the winter. On my morning run, I did a little video on this actually. On my morning run, I don't run off clearly. I'm not a big runner, right? But I do love running. But there's a little 5k loop, and there's a point where I come across the M42, and there's a beautiful field. It's ploughed downhill. So all the water will take all the soil with it as it goes downhill. And you have to, when you step off the field step off the edge into the field to follow the path through the middle of it, you drop down. And when we moved in 12 years ago, you drop down about 15 centimetres, 6 inches for you oldies. So you drop down six inches. Over time, I'm now dropping down nearly 30 centimetres, nearly a foot. And that has been demonstrable in the time that I've been there. It's on the side of a hill, it's wind exposed. So firstly, we're adding too much chemical, which then gets washed into the oceans in the end.
So those chemicals are to feed the soil or and sort of get rid of weeds? And
Both of those things, yeah. So we're using pesticides, herbicides and fertilisers, and only 16% of what we put on the soil gets absorbed to do any good. The rest, 84%, gets just washed away. But the wind is the big issue here on this particular site. So it's a very exposed northern facing slope, and the wind just whips the soil away. And you, if you park down in the village, down at Oakthorpe, your car will be permanently covered in a very thin layer of dust. We're throwing away the thing that we need. Soil is the capital for the future, and we're just letting it wash away and blow away. And that's one of the things.
It's interesting. This morning you made a really interesting comment, which I didn't know actually, where we were talking about climate change, and you were saying that actually agricultural runoff is the worst thing for the seas, where everybody thinks it's plastic waste, and you said actually that's third. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So you've got climate change, then overfishing, and then of the ocean debris. By far the biggest impact is agricultural runoff.
Yeah. It's really interesting. That's terrifying that that's still the problem. I mean, obviously it's a global issue rather than a local issue.
Yeah.
But so it's. And I learnt something really interesting about soil recently, which I'd never seen before, and I didn't really understand it. And I went with Sam, who founded Planted, to a site in Beer Regis. So we went with a woman called Julia Davis. That's her name? Julia Davis, and she'd invested some money to buy a 300-acre farm near Beer Regis for the Dorset Wildlife Trust, and it used to be owned by the Drax family, who the MP, Tory MP. So I'm not going to slander him, but probably isn't an issue these days. Tory MPs good at slandering themselves. They My local MP in Devon is the gentleman who's just resigned, by the way. And
tractor fancy.
The guy about the tractors, yeah, exactly. So the 300 acres that she invested in the Dorset Wildlife Trust, we went to walk around the land, and there was nothing growing on this land. So the last crop had been taken out as wheat, and it had been taken out in June, I think, July last year. And when we went there, there was literally nothing growing on this land, and I didn't understand. And what she explained with the guy from the Dorset Wildlife Trust basically explained that the soil had nothing left in it, and the only thing it could grow was wheat. So it had 2 crops on it for the last 20 to 30 years, and it's completely barren, bleak as anything. The only thing you could see is some of the voles and moles and stuff coming up through the earth, but the soil was just, there was nothing on it. It's nothing green, nothing growing, anything. And I didn't really understand. And it's basically, they don't rest it, they don't cover it in the winter, they till it constantly, so you end up with the wheat going back in. The wheat grows because it's got used to it, because they feed it with a chemical. And basically, because there's nothing growing in the land, none of the grasses had picked up on this land. It's just this barren wasteland. And you're thinking, and then the worst thing is, I think they were growing the crops only to feed the cattle, which was even worse.
We're creating deserts.
It's a desert, yeah, exactly.
But I mean, are you giving
terrifying
farmers a hard time? I mean, they are the perceived guardians of our soil. Surely that's their livelihood, isn't it?
Yeah.
Surely they should be the ones kind of going, yeah, that's barren.
Well,
Is that not a role that they actually own?
I mean, not all farmers are terrible, there's no doubt about it. I mean, we're 100% organic farm, I believe in the Soil Association.
You only have
organic
to drive around to see the enormous amount of sort of tilling and ploughing and digging and soil runoff in any part of the country.
Yeah.
Farmers are not bad people.
No.
But they're operating in a really broken system.
Yeah.
And regardless of your views on the European Union generally, and trust me, I'm sad, the common agricultural policy was dreadfully broken. To be paid to produce in that way makes no long-term economic and environmental sense. The word eco comes from the Greek word oikos, meaning home, and it sits in economy and it sits in ecology, and they're united. We've pulled them apart by mistake. It makes no economic or ecologic sense to pay a farmer to farm in the way that he or she has been farming in for the last 30 years. Something had to change, and farmers know this, but some farmers know nothing but this. It's 30 years of doing it. And of course, when your yield's down, you ring your supplier and say yield was down. And so you put more chemical on. So more chemical on this year is a guaranteed way of increasing your food grown next year and a guaranteed way of decreasing the food that will be grown in 10 years' time. And we confuse short-term and medium-term massively here. And then this, I'm going to sound like, God, I'm getting old. We need to go back to the old ways of doing it. Rotational systems, winter covers, nitrogen fixing, use of legumes. It's not, and the stats are really interesting. The stats I've seen indicate that there is a greater yield and a greater income, but less mechanisation and more work. Now that feels counterintuitive to some, but the stats are really fascinating. The future here is to look at India and Africa and the India Farmers Collective that are pulling together. 85% of Indian farms are less than 2 hectares. So people have to pull together, not just to share resources, which is a great thing, but actually to share expertise. And that's where we need to look.
So what are they doing in India?
So they've just adopted a policy of every farm must be regenerative. They've called it traditional agriculture, but it's a regenerative agriculture. And then they're building systems and digital systems, all based on text, where people can share their resources and share their knowledge. That's just been launched last year. So 2020, where are we? I actually forgot what year. Are we in 2022? Yeah, 2021. We're in the future and we're in the past equally. So it's really interesting. The emerging nations will lead on this because they can bypass, fingers crossed, many of the mistakes that we've made. But to answer your original question, farmers aren't bad. They're just operating in a really broken system.
Do you think they're reluctant to change because they're only seeing these sort of short-term benefits? And
well, they've been taught this way, right? So who did I meet recently? I was chatting to someone that came through agricultural college 20 years ago, and I met her at the Save Our Soils conference, and she said everything I learned in college, everything that every one of us learned, was absolutely wrong, and we're now having to unlearn it. 20 years of unlearning. That's staggering. Who leads that? Is it the NFU? Are they doing it? I don't know. I'm not suggesting that they're not, but are they doing it? We need some way of getting the message out, not just to the farmers, but to us. We buy their produce, and we don't ask enough questions about it. We're all struggling to feed ourselves and warm ourselves at the moment. This cost of living crisis is not going to go away. It's a really interesting, challenging way that we have to change the system.
So with that, what are the kind of current threats to our food systems? I mean, we've talked about some of the issues of sort of short-term thinking with soil health. What are the other threats? Obviously, there's a lot going on internationally. We're hearing about the breadbasket of Ukraine threatening food prices. What are the other sort of threats to our food systems?
You've got global conflict and political instability is the one that's closest to our minds at the moment. But I would say global water shortage, absolutely huge. Overuse of antibiotics, going to damage the meat industry if we're not careful. And that the link between what we eat and our own health is massive. The antibiotic resistance that we're seeing emerging in every single country in the planet is not just linked to the amount of antibiotics we take, it's the amount of antibiotics we eat through our meat, which is why organic is a really important thing. And then I think there's this whole challenge around eating too much. I don't mean we overeat, but we're in calorie excess, but we're in nutritional deficit. That is a really challenging thing. You can be obese and nutritionally deficit at the same time. That worries me hugely. And the people that pay the price for that are the people that are on the lowest income, and that's really unfair.
It seems to me the water challenge is really interesting. So I find that locally, we have a local farm in Devon, and I've noticed that the change in the seasons and the change in the sort of the dryness. So at the moment, for instance, we're all complaining about the weather you're especially good at that. The weather's been shit today, but the reality is that we really need this rain. I mean, if you look at most farms at the moment, it's been really dry for this year so far in the West Country where we are down in Devon. There's a lot of dryness around. We're really water low. And we've learnt that in the last month or so. So we're based on an artesian well system, and actually the well's now dry. We were buying water in last week to fill our storage systems because our well was really close to the bottom and the pump wasn't. It was stuck in the silt and it wasn't feeding. So there's not enough water for, we've got wildflower meadows, which, well, you were there last week, you've just seen them. They haven't come out of the ground. And, we can't water them from the water system at the moment because there's not enough water. So I think water depletion, or the lack of, through climate change, is really problematic. And then I think the other thing is the amount of waste is just insane. I mean, it's literally disgusting. We've got colossal amounts of food, and the
where's that waste happening? And is that per family? Is there a kind of wider distribution problem? And we're kind of hearing about kind of labour shortages and
it's definitely a consumer problem, isn't there? We buy too much and we waste a lot. At the end of the day, things are packaged. So every supermarket you go into, there's not open food where you can buy one apple. You're buying 6 or 10 or 4 or whatever, and you might not need all of those things, but you're not buying individual fruit. It's not like going to the greengrocers ages ago. You'd be buying what you want. At the end of the day, there are very few. Like where I live, there's one greengrocer. It's local. You could buy an apple if you want. You can also buy 10. But if you go into the local supermarket, they're all packaged and there's riddled plastic. So there's waste everywhere. And of course, we refrigerate lots of this. And, we end up creating this waste. We might make food and then we don't save it. There's far too much food waste. There's obviously food waste systems, which, all the local authorities now bring into being. So, it's easy to throw your waste into the food waste thing because, it goes off. Somebody comes and collects it, like your bins. There's not self-composting, is a great thing. But at the end of the day, you can't do that with all the food waste that you have. You need an anaerobic digester, not a composting system. You can't put all the cooked meats into things like that.
Haven't really been put in place.
No, they haven't been put in place at all.
Way.
They are on their way, of course they are.
It's interesting, the stats are dead clear. A third of what we grow never makes the retailer. It's either out of spec, the apples are the wrong size, the meat was dispatched too young or too old. A third of what we grow and raise does not make the retailer. It's lost before we even see it. And then a third of what makes the retailer, we buy and then we throw away, right? Yeah. So those 2/3 added together don't make 2/3, they make 51%, you compound them. 51% of the food that we grow is wasted and people are starving.
Yeah.
And prices are crazy. This is dreadfully upsetting. And that could be down to a millimetre measure on an apple, 2 millimetres too big. Therefore, it's rejected. We know the size and price of everything and the value of nothing. And I've been in that world, and that's what it's like. The eggs, we raise chickens, and after 1 year, they're dispatched or sold into charity because they begin to get little calcium imperfections, little barnacles and lumps on them that the consumer, i.e. real people, apparently don't want. How many of you who eat eggs would mind eating a flecked egg? Anyone got an objection to it? No one ever has had an objection to a flecked egg. However, as the Morrisons, Sainsbury's and Tesco's are saying, no, there's flecks on it, we're not having it. And so the system, it's not the farmers, it's the system. And when you've got a system that's based on aesthetics, price and availability, then you lose produce. And we have a system, you walk into a supermarket and it feels like you have choice. You can buy 2 types of garlic in a supermarket, and yet there are 56 different species of garlic that are grown in this country. How has this happened? It's happened because of commoditization and simplicity of retail, and there's a huge problem there. But what an opportunity for the retailer that turns round, and it will probably be the Co-op or Morrisons maybe. They're the 2 largest farmers in the country. Turns round and says, actually, we're going to change this. And that's the show Hugh needs to do.
Yeah. So getting on to that, the power of storytelling is obviously fundamental. Hugh and River Cottage have done an amazing job. I mean, they've sort of got in there with quite an alternative way of thinking about food and promoting that not many other chefs have. I mean, other chefs have done big campaigns, but it's been a consistent thread of Hugh's work. What's he doing there that's appealing to people? Why has it been so successful?
I think his one standpoint is that he doesn't take money from the retailers. That's what's helped him say what he wants. He can do shows with Mark's been on where you can you could criticize Starbucks, you can criticize all these people. Lots of the other people in that environment have taken money from the retailers, to promote their work. It's very hard to criticize with one hand and take their cash with another. So I think his opportunity has allowed him to do that, and he's doing it again now. On the new show, there's definitely there's a lot of work around local, so local, sustainable, a bit like the macro economy, village economy, Schumacher system, where you're working with a village economy and there's a bartering system. We work a lot with that, but there's also some critiques of big retailers and where they're getting their produce from. I mean, take for instance, you talk about the co-op. They've got organic tomatoes on the list, but they're flown in from Peru.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a good system? We are 100% organic at River Cottage, but do you think it's better to get a locally grown non-organic tomato, or do you think it's better to fly it in from Peru? Yeah. Personally, I think the local side of it's an improvement. Yeah. Do we really want those air miles just because it's got a certification on it? Isn't really a positive thing at the end of the day.
Yeah. So the question to me seems to be, and I went to visit Stewart at River Cottage a week or so ago, and it's an absolute idyll. It's kind of like a beautiful little Eden, and it's so wonderful and it's inspirational. But how do you scale up the incredible things that are happening there for the bigger supermarkets, for those bigger retailers? How do you get them engaged in that kind of complete
But didn't Mark just suggest that, with Indian cooperatives, if they're small 2 hectare sites, I mean, we're 100 acres, so, we're 40 hectares or something like that,
50,
if you think about, you've got a lot of people together, I mean, this sort of economy where everybody's collectively coming together. The coffee industry seems to have done that strangely,
They've done that really well, and
they have,
and the surprising hero. God, I don't think I can't believe I'm saying these words. One of the catalysts is Nestle.
Yeah.
And Christ, I fought Nestle all through the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
But what they're doing with fair trade farmers is an interesting addition to the model, and collectively coming together and creating not just better coffee, but protecting. They know that if they knacker the soil, they won't have a business in 5 years' time. Yeah. It wasn't like that 10 years ago in coffee. It was very, very different. And the revolution we've seen in coffee, just for example in processing, rather than wet processing, like dry processing, natural processed coffee. So you let the flavour from a coffee bean comes from two things. Firstly, the roast, how long you keep it roasting for, and secondly, from the acidity and flavour of what's called the cherry, the fruit that sits around the bean. And what we've shifted away from is get rid of the fruit because it's you can't control it. Whereas you can control a roast, it's got minutes and degrees. Whereas the bean, the cherry, who knows? We're letting it sit in the cherry for longer, and we're getting those fermentation tones, those sourdough tones into the bean, and then we're processing the bean once it's fermented, and that's much kinder to the planet. It gives you a stock of fruit that you can then put back on the ground as a fertilizer for next year, and we can taste more in the coffee. So coffee is a brilliant example of where we're beginning to do this very, very well.
But bringing those collectives together, I mean, in Devon we can't rear all our own animals and we can't grow all our own vegetables, produce. So we work with Hay Farm, which is a local, one of our neighbours, so owned by the Bollioni family that own Petersham Nurseries in London. It's a 60-acre farm. Harry, who runs it, is very specifically interested in pigs. He grows a lot of brassicas, and he has a lot of chickens, and they're free roaming, fully organic. So we buy a lot of eggs from him, we buy a lot of pork from him, and we buy a lot of brassicas from him. Adjacent farm to that is Trill Farm, which used to be owned by Romy Fraser, who founded Neal's Yard Remedies in London, and she bought this 300-acre farm. She's sold it recently, but they do all of the growing of leaves. So Ash and Kate, who run that sort of market garden, they grow all the leaves. So we work with them. We end up, with Harry, we're bartering all the time. We do things with him. He brings his tractor over and does stuff for us. So we do collectively together create enough of an economy that's bigger than the single farm that we have or anyone else in that area. So there is an opportunity to work with retailers where you grow those scales, I think. One of the problems is, industrial agriculture. You mentioned it this morning about the potatoes, which was a terrifying story about Asda, when somebody's on the phone saying, okay, it's what was it, 17 pence from 22 pence
Yeah.
or something. And you know, the guy's on the road with his potatoes. He's getting 20-something pence. He's nearly at the depot to deliver them. Somebody calls him and says, I'm sorry, we can only give you 17 pence. You're charging too much. We say, well, I'm already delivering them. Well, take it or leave it. You know, turn around and go home. We don't want them if you're not willing to take that price. The pressure from the retailers to the supermarket, hopefully it's better these days than it was then.
That's been
It has
legal,
to
yeah,
be
delegalised.
whatever that
word is.
yeah,
Made
it's
illegal.
made criminal. But you know, the collective is that those people have so much pressure on them. If you get together as a collective, like the cooperatives that the coffee industry's brought into play, you do end up with power to be able to create enough to sell to the retailers and actually keep the price at a sensible level that allows you to make money. I mean, milk's got to be one of the most tricky.
Yeah, it's
I would
really
have thought that, you know, the milk industry, the retailers pay so little for milk. I mean, I don't really use much milk, and we don't use a huge amount. But you know, at the end of the day, I think the pressure on the milk industry the dairy industry is enormous.
So the power of community and groups and manufacturers getting together.
Yeah.
So when we were talking on the phone recently, you mentioned this kind of amazing example of how a community had got together to change the way they eat, to change their fortunes, to change literally the shape of the city.
Yeah.
And you talked about what was happening in Detroit.
Yeah.
Could you just kind of share that
Yeah,
story?
of course, it's a beautiful story. Best told by a woman called Davita Davison, who was the firebrand and the architect behind this. But just briefly, Detroit is a massive, sprawling city. Car industry was huge. Ford were based there. It's incredible. The rush away from racism and the rush north of the black populations fueled an economic and therefore musical, Tamla Motown based there, resurgence in that city. And then as the car industry changed and wilted, and the jobs were lost, Detroit became the poster child for urban decay. It went bankrupt, and Davita is just the most amazing campaigner. She just fills me with utter joy. Just thinking of her makes me smile. And she looked at Detroit and she looked at its health problems, and she went, people here are sick. People here, the black population here, they're eating food that they wouldn't have eaten at home. They're eating very little vegetables. They're eating fried chicken, all the things that you associate with a kind of Caribbean diet. You are not very often eaten in the Caribbean, but they are perceived to be. So she went back to basics and she said, what we do have in Detroit is everyone's got a big backyard. So I'm going to start growing in everyone's backyard. I'm going to teach them to grow. I'm going to teach them to change their diet away from meat heavy to meat light, still meat. She reversed type 2 diabetes in 90% of people with type 2 diabetes in her trial. And she reduced coronary heart disease risk, blood pressure, and changed the health of the majority of people in her trial. Mostly, people were eating better for less money. Detroit is now doing really, really well. Not all to do with Davita. She's good, but that's a challenge, right? She's really good. And she's taken that model and she's taken it to the suburbs of Sydney in Australia. And they've then taken it to other parts of Australia. And it's now got wings. And you can see her TED talk, or I did a podcast with her, but it's over Zoom, so it's
Quite a formidable character.
She is amazing. Yeah. And we need more Davitas. We need more Hughes. I mean, Hughes' independence, you're absolutely right. That's what makes it. Everyone loves a posho as well in this country, right? So Hughes got a couple of things going for him. But that independence, the stubbornness to find the truth over the story creates the story, and that's what Hughes sees. I love that about him.
But those people are out there, aren't they? I mean, because what's happened in Detroit to change the very nature of the city, excuse the pun, has been happening in England in a slightly different way in Todmorden as well, hasn't it?
Yeah. So Todmorden's a great town nestled in between Huddersfield, Halifax, and Manchester. And my good friend Pam Warburton, who used to be the leader of the council in Calderdale in Halifax, she set up a project called Incredible Edible. I'm certain you've all heard of it. It's been replicated elsewhere. There's an amazing Incredible Edible in Bristol, actually, and my friend Sarah was here earlier. She's one of the leaders in that. And that whole idea of saying there's a spot of land there, put a plum tree in it, can we plant some chard outside the police station? Well, we're not going to ask them, we're just going to do it. This bravery, almost, it's not arrogance, it's beyond that. This irreverence that she showed has changed that town. And it's a different scale to Detroit because the backyards are smaller and the hills are like this.
It's all on a very sort of British scale, isn't it?
Very British, yeah, I absolutely love it. It's rebellious on a British scale. Don't tell anyone, just do it.
It is when you see it, and then like we even put corn outside the police station. You know, it's little like 2 fingers up in the shape of a kind of corn stalk. It's kind of brilliant.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
She's brilliant, and you can see her again. She's done an amazing TED talk and a podcast with many people, including me. She's just one of those. And I've known Pam for 30 years, and she was formidable in the council, and she's formidable now, and long may she continue.
So obviously there's lots of change going on, and these changes that we're seeing in the city with people growing their own is having a difference. We're seeing a lot of different diets coming out as well. You know, not just kind of carnivore, vegetarian, pescatarian, veganism, climatarianism. All these sort of
Flexitarian, isn't that you, Oliver?
I was until I had the piss taken out of me so much by my mates because I was basically holier than thou, but you know had all the benefits of being a meat eater, but still was basically still pretty good. So I had to change that, and I'm now a vegetarian, but for the better. So there are all these changes. I mean, do you think we're also going to be seeing further changes? I'm conscious that what's going on in the soil right now and the health of the soil is largely down to soil microbiota that we also have within our own stomachs. I mean, should we be treating the soil in a way that we want to be treating ourselves and looking after our own microbiota as well? What sort of role? I mean, I think this is kind of a really interesting emerging area of our diets and our health that is mirrored by what we need to be doing for our soils.
What's happening there is happening here, and the gut health brain health link is now massive. As we restrict the gut biology, there's a great book by a woman called Julia Enders, German physician. She's written this book, and it's just called Gut, but it's a kind of light-hearted look at your poop, and she's utterly amazing. And we've restricted our gut flora, our gut bacteria, to such a small degree. I think we get. Please forgive me, I might have got the figures wrong. 90% of our calories come from, I think, 3 crops, four main crops. 95% come from 30 crops. That's for certain. So we've restricted the amount of the variation of food that we eat, and that has had a knock-on impact. And there's a link between the gut flora diversity, depression, anxiety, feelings of suicide. This link is known, and so that mental health, gut health link is massive. So yes, eat fermented foods. There's some really good examples here actually. Eat a wide range, but even things like B12. So when you cut meat out of your diet, you often become deficient in B12. We're seeing meat eaters deficient in B12 because B12 doesn't come from meat. It comes from the dirt that the animals eat by mistake as they're grazing. And as we've moved away from grazed cattle to corn-fed cattle, particularly in the US, we've seen B12 deficiency happen throughout the population. We are what we eat. Eat as many variations, as many colours as you can. And the animal thing is really interesting. I don't eat animals often, but in a regenerative system, we need them. We just need around about 20% of what we've got now. So eating less and better, absolutely the way to go.
I mean, the gut biome's obviously become very much into the public realm these days. I mean, you can see that by, if I look at the books that we have that are popular and they've been written recently. So my partner Rachel wrote the River Cottage fermentation book. It's selling at the fastest rate of any of the River Cottage handbooks now, if you look at it across the sort of Bloomsbury scale. Hugh's last book was called Eat Better Forever. There's lots of fermented foods in it. This whole process is becoming wider, which has got to be a good thing because people are understanding their own gut biome. There's lots of testing available now. It's a lot more effective. And, we teach courses on fermentation. We teach sort of courses on gut health at River Cottage, and they're incredibly popular. They're becoming the popular courses, rather than the traditional courses like Pig in a Day, the meat courses, things like that. You're starting to get the courses which are all about gut health and people's health, the diet. And it's not about specific diet, whether it's keto or whatever it is. It's more about just people actually understanding the foods they're putting into their body and actually being able to engage in how to work that. I mean, traditionally, my grandmothers, both of them, we're talking back in the 60s and before the supermarkets were really around, fermented foods were everything, and they were always in their larders and stuff, and then it disappeared, and now it's back again. It seems to be a lot more fermented foods in people's lives these days, and there's a lot of opportunities to learn how to do it. I mean, it's not particularly difficult, but it's good to get the sort of direction, and people come on courses all the time, so there's got to be a good thing then. And if any of those fermented products in your diet really do help your gut biome. And we at River Cottage, we make kefir, we make kombucha, we make krauts, kimchis, all of these types of products. So, and they're really, they're great, they taste great, but they are healthy for your diet, healthier. So, if that's becoming more into the public psyche, that's a good thing. You can go to the supermarkets now and you can look at, Waitrose as a classic. There's a load of fermented products on the shelf these days. I'm not sure they're all as live as they say they are, but there are lots of them.
It needs to be. It's a really interesting point. You buy sourdough bread, and it might have a spoonful of starter, and the rest is yeast.
That's hopeless.
Totally, you buy kombucha that's been pasteurised. It's not. That isn't going to do you any good.
It's not live.
Dig a bit deeper. Get closer to the producer. That's. I remember the first time I bought kombucha was in Haworth. In the Metropolitan District of Bradford, although they hate me saying that, and it was from a garage off the main street. And when I say garage, I mean it was somewhere someone kept their car. And I remember being recommended by Offshoot's health food shop to go there. And I knocked on the door, and this bloke came out covered in grease from fixing his car. I said, "Do you sell this thing called kombucha?" It was the 90s. And he said, yeah, do you want one? I said, yeah. So he topped it up for me, put the lid on it, and he said, now it's live. How far are you travelling? I said, I've got to drive back to Saltaire. And he said, I'd stop around Bingley and just degas it. And it was lethal. But I remember when my granddad died, so little simple things like ginger beer plants. So we made ginger beer for years. My granddad made ginger beer. We didn't know he'd made ginger beer the month before he got cancer. He died really quickly. And then he died in July. And in August, we were sat in the garden at my nan's house. And we just heard what we thought were gunshots. And it was all this ginger beer that he'd put in the summer house, just bursting.
Yeah.
But that's fermented food. It isn't complex. It's beautiful, and we can all do it.
But we become sufficiently disconnected from it that we don't realise we can make it. We can engage in that process.
Exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of nearing the end. You're obviously both heavily involved in food production and food systems and soil health. Could you tell us some inspirational names or one or two inspirational people in your world who people in the audience can go away and look up? Who's doing interesting things? And it could be a writer, it could be a farm, a manufacturer, other than Hugh. Of course, because I think we know.
Does anyone want who?
Who's doing interesting things?
Well, have you all seen Kiss the Ground? It's in the film Kiss the Ground.
Really good.
Right.
Yeah.
So first off, go and watch a film called Kiss the Ground. It's American, but it's brilliant, right? It's genuinely
narrated by.
It's rated by
Woody
Harrelson.
Yeah.
But Finian Makepeace is the guy who sits partially behind that with Woody, and it's one of those films that genuinely, in an hour and a half, will make you question everything you eat. Not in a vegan, keto, whatever way. In a, oh my God, the answer is underneath that meter. That meter that sits below there gives birth to literally every bit of life on the planet, and we're breaking it. And Kiss the Ground is the thing, and Finian Makepeace. That's utterly magical. And I can't remember their name, and you're going to have to forgive me, and I'll have to send it on to you. But they spoke at the Save Our Soil event a year ago, and the two sheep farmers, husband and wife, from the bit between Keighley and Lancashire, whatever that bit, Pendle, and they've got a collective, exactly what you described. They can't produce enough, not just animal, but they grow as well, enough beautiful food. So they're now zipping together all of these really small independent farmers. And the key here is they know what to do. They don't have access to market. These two have gained access to market, and they do it in a really altruistic way. But I can't remember the name, and I'm a bit embarrassed. But Ian and sorry, I'm really sorry.
Hey, my daughter's over there.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
You've so well. You hadn't sworn.
I've done well. That is pretty good. I do have some form of Tourette's.
The last 5 minutes.
But I'll forward it on to you.
Okay.
So for me, there's another American, Dan Barber. So wrote a book called The Third Plate. He's a little bit like Hugh in America. He owns Blue Hill at Stone Barns up in North New York State, an incredible farm where he's really interested in sort of waste and how you don't produce a lot of waste in the food industry. A really interesting character, definitely worth looking at. And then somebody from our alma mater, Carolyn Steele, from the Bartlett at UCL, where Oliver and I went to school. So she's written a couple of really interesting books. Satopia, which is a really good one. And what's the other one called? Hungry City. So, I think people like that are really interesting because they're writing about it in a really sort of interesting way from a very particular standpoint. I mean, she's an architect trained.
She talks a lot about how cities have been informed by food.
Exactly, been informed by food, exactly. And Dan Barber, very much about organic farming and how you grow your own and what it's, it's, I think, really important, growing your own food, even if it's just a window box with herbs, or if you have got a garden growing your own, there's something really rewarding about doing that. And I think it really helps, at the end of the day. If we're all growing our own food in some small way, make a radical difference.
We completely understand that process, and the amount of energy, intensity, water.
Exactly, all the things that you need for this thing to survive. Absolutely.
And it takes growing your own potatoes is absolutely ludicrous financially.
Yeah.
It's the best thing in the world. Dan Barber, if you want the kind of quick version to that, he was on episode 2 of series 1 of Chef's Table in America, and it's really, really worth watching. He explains the third plate in around about 45 minutes. So you can please read the book; it's brilliant. But you can also watch that; it's really good.
So he did in 45 minutes. The third plate in just less than 45 seconds.
Okay,
what's the third plate?
The third. Do you want to go first?
No, you go first.
The third plate. Put meat as an accompaniment rather than the main part of your meal. Know where everything's grown. Use less chemical input to grow everything. Eat less, waste nothing.
Yeah, eat less, waste nothing is the mantra from it, isn't it?
Brilliant. Well, I think that is. I was going to ask you what are your top tips, but I think that completely nails it. So, questions. There's got to be some questions. Who's got a question? And if you could just wait, we've got Bex has got a microphone, so we can all hear you.
Everyone likes their pet dogs, and so do I. Are they a problem in achieving our climate objectives and lowering carbon emissions?
It's a great question, that is. A friend of mine once he has a real problem with pet dogs, and he had a 4-wheel drive. And so he said, I need you to prove to me this myth or this thing that I read, that a pet dog is worse than driving an Audi Q7. And I thought, that's rubbish. See how I edited myself then. And so I went and looked at the carbon impact of an average pet dog's food intake and a Q7, and you can have 8 pet dogs versus an Audi Q7, right? Number 1, it's an Audi, don't bother. Number 2, unless you're a farmer, you probably don't need a 4-wheel drive. I appreciate there are exceptions to that. But yeah, if we have pets that eat a diet that is damaging, then for certain it is going to hinder our journey to net zero and beyond. I don't want to get very Toy Story about it. I think it's really important that we look at not just our diet but at everything. And I've got chickens. Our dogs eat scraps. We have got 3 dogs there, and it is lunacy. We're managing one out at the moment. So she's old, so we're not going to get rid of her. But yeah, it's really important where your food comes from. But you pay, we give our dogs good food, and it costs a lot of money, and that is a massive barrier to the decisions that we each of us make and can afford to make. It's a good point. Thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Wow, it looks like you've completely nailed it. Everything they need to know. Was there one? That was a heckle.
If anyone's question curious but a bit shy, we'll just loiter after, and you can come and sidle up.
Yeah. put a kind of theoretical question on the air. God.
Slightly sort of relates to teenagers. So I've sort of found that in lockdown, and our 2 teenage boys stopped wanting to eat food, but they'll eat a ton of fruit, or they'll eat yogurt. But the biggest thing you did was planted a damson tree, and it was a really small tree. But our teenage son, also not too interested in many things, has then made damson jam, and he's now planning the next harvest. And we found one of the best things we did was reintroduce damson jam into our lives, which I remember as a kid. But it's a really small tree that you can put in any garden. But he's now just totally addicted to making jam, particularly damson jam. So I just thought I'd share that because
it is the second best jam, right?
Yeah.
It's the second best jam.
After.
Blackcurrant, obviously.
But it's that small step that now he's really interested in how he can make his own food.
And
He's a teenager.
if
and
we can instill that passion in our kids, then we're doing something right. And I've got a granddaughter. She's 3 next 2 weeks time, and all our 4 kids they've all got fruit trees and they've all done stuff. And if I can see Junie make stuff and absolutely love to make stuff, and then we plant strawberries, and they've just moved the house. They're literally about less than 20 yards from ours at the moment. But to watch her plant in the garden, that's amazing, because what becomes a damson tree becomes damson jam, becomes a side project, becomes understanding how to brand good food, becomes understanding how to go out and change the world with a business. The enterprise has broken the planet. It's the only thing that can fix it as well. And I love hearing that. I really do. So yes, more soft fruit trees for your kids. Yeah.
But I guess engaging in crafts and making something that is delicious, that probably got a ton of sugar in, probably helps.
You can use chia seed and no sugar, and then you get it goes off quite quickly, but you get the same consistency as jam with very little sugar, no sugar.
Good tip.
Just another footnote to that. I mean, our 2 boys. Well, the other thing we did in lockdown was, at dinner time you dish up the kids' food, and then there's that verbal battle of finish your food, and there's the waste. What we started doing was actually cooking in a large pan, and then just dumping it on the middle of the table, and just saying help yourself. There's nothing left at the end of the meal. Ironically, we don't know what.
Interesting.
It's interesting.
And it was the smells. I have to admit, it was actually something Jamie Oliver said. In lockdown, he did a programme, just said, put everything in the middle of the table, smell it, they'll see it, they'll eat more, and it really works.
But it's increasing that participation. If things come to you pre-portioned on a plate, you're another step disassociated with the process of creating your own food. And I know it's not the same as growing it, but I think anything you can do to bridge that gap is important. Lovely, thank you.
Good. Nice tips. Thank you. Last chance. Any questions? Okay. All right. Well,
We've got one at the back there.
Oh, one at the back?
Yeah.
Oh, behind the camera. I didn't see that. Okay.
Sorry, I missed the start, so I don't know if you've maybe mentioned it, but how would you encourage somebody to look past the sort of gentrification of organic food and eating well? And so many times I've been faced with somebody saying, it's so expensive. They're like a mum of 5 and they're going to go to Lidl and buy the cheapest kind of pack of chicken because it's going to feed the most people. And what would your reply be to it's really expensive?
This is the best question of the day.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you turned up. And I know it's good because Stuart's just said, yeah, that's one for you. So,
So I know he knows the answer.
I don't know the answer. I wish I did. Food gentrification, food elitism, for want of another word, is a real problem. Poverty is romanced only by fools. Not having enough food to eat is desperately sad. And we live in a country where the number of food banks has gone up by, I think, around about 100-fold in the last 5 years. That's broken. So the key thing is to eat as much food, to grow as much food as you can, if you have space, and often you don't, and to realise that actually really good food that is grown, it can be cheaper than food that is produced. But if you do the calculation per calorie, it's not. The calculation per calorie will give you the greatest calorie density from mass processed food, and that is heartbreaking. the way that we do this is we do this by destigmatizing it, and we do this by making this democratized, so that everyone deserves good food. I'd rather people eat a whole food diet that isn't organic. I think it's important to be organic, but I'd rather them do that than to eat the shite that you can buy, at takeaways all around the country. It's the question of the day. I don't have the answer, but thank you for asking it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to Mark and to Stewart, to you all for joining us on this slightly cold but not raining afternoon. It's been a total pleasure speaking to these two, and I've had the chance to speak to them over the last couple of weeks and hear about these stories as well in more depth. So absolutely fascinating. So can we have a big round of applause for our panellists? So thank you very much. My name's Oliver Heath, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of Planted Country. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your stay here at the show.